Thank you, Honorable Minister of Health. It's my honor now to introduce and ask her to make her contribution, the Honorable Member, Ms. Catherine Hughes. Honorable Member, before you start, I just want members to know that the Honorable Member, Mr. Ford, had an average of about 85 decibel in the House, and Frank was enthusiastically, the Honorable Member, welcome, and he averaged about 90. Honorable Member, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What can I say about the last presenter? Let me say that he was like a pencil with absolutely no point. And I will deal with his points later on. Mr. Speaker, I wish to start by thanking the officers in our public service who have worked tirelessly to make this budget a reality. I wish to single out the members of the Ministry of Finance, our teachers, our frontline workers, our healthcare workers, and other Guyanese who have held this country together at this most difficult time. You are the salt of the earth, and we say to you, thank you. It is with great sadness, Mr. Speaker, that I stand here today as a member of the National Assembly of this honorable House. Sadness because, in all honesty, I cannot say that we have truly served the people of Guyana with all that has taken place in the last 7 days. I was thankful that in the early stages of this 12th Parliament, I was forced to be out of the jurisdiction and could attend virtually. It has been difficult to sit here and face the vitriol, the attacks on my sensibility, and the abuse that I have never received from any member of my family or close friend. We have been forced to drown in this madness in this very House. Mr. Speaker, you see, we come here to serve with the best of intentions. Each morning I come here, I tell myself, just ignore, just shut your mouth. And after the incessant bloodletting, I'm ashamed to say, I too find myself responding and becoming all that I despise about the way we're doing things in this Parliament. A wise Martin Carter, who wrote 40 years ago, said, we are all consumed. Mr. Speaker, the situation is made worse when some sections of our media refuse to provide a balanced report. That is one that can be deemed fair and objective, the tenets of any good journalist. Instead, what we got, in this case from Kaichor News, was a singling out of a series of comments with no response or no coverage of the words that facilitated, that initially brought and the retort and the reaction, invoked the reaction. Mr. Speaker, I don't need to tell the LGBTQ community in Guyana of my unwavering support to their right to choose and to enjoy all the basic rights. Lest we forget in 2006, when SASOD tried to host their very first Painting the Spectrum Film Festival, they came to me at Sidewalk Cafe, saying that nobody was willing to offer them a venue. Time, Mr. Speaker, does and reveals some interesting things. When the Minister of Education can stand here in her rant and say, you have a friend in us, I want her to remember that it was her own colleague, the current minister with responsibility for public infrastructure, who actually, a man of the cloth, who had very different words to say, that's reported in Stabrook News, June 29, 2010. The interreligious organization yesterday accused SASOD of attempting to corrupt young minds in society by using gay and lesbian films to promote homosexuality. He said, gays and lesbians are internationally accepted and are allowed certain rights, even marriage. But that doesn't mean that Guyana has to submit to a Western culture. Do not come to us in this house and think that you could speak when you have a big blob in your eye. I suggest you look in the mirror. Wikipedia states, and I
Honourable
quote,
Minister, I hear some words which I won't allow. Mr. McCoy, Honourable Member, please.
Mr. Speaker, as Wikipedia quotes, and I would like to quote, the then President of Guyana, Barra Jagdeo, of the People's Progressive Party, refused to sign the amendment bill. And I know you're asking what amendment bill. I want to remind you that in 2010, during the constitutional reform process, this Parliament voted to outlaw discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. And I just gave you the quote of who refused to sign off on it. Now, tell me, who can we trust? Who can trust what is said by this other side, who continuously try to repeat and to change history? Mr. Speaker, what comes to mind is the line in Jesus Christ Superstar, when Jesus Christ gets angry and he says, what is truth? Is it an unchanging law? What is truth? Is mine the same as yours? Mr. Speaker, regrettably, the absence of truth is displayed in the first line of the budget presentation when we're asked to accept a theme, a path to recovery, economic dynamism, and resilience. Recovery, Mr. Speaker? Recovery from what? In September 2019, the IMF declares Guyana the fastest growing economy in the world. November 2nd, 2019, Bloomberg reports Guyana's GDP grew 14 times as fast as China's will in the last year. CNBC, in the same month, Guyana's economy is projected to grow by 86% in 2020. Mr. Speaker, I would like to reference the press release of the International Monetary Fund, September 11, 2019. Guyana's economic growth strengthened in 2018, since 2018, with broad-based expansion across all major sectors. Real GDP grew by 4.1%, led by the construction and services industries. They go on to say economic growth is projected at 4.4% in 2019, all the same time when this Apnu+Afc government is in place. And guess what? They go on to say, the directors welcome Guyana's broad-based economic expansion in recent years, underpinned by prudent macroeconomic policies. Directors noted the midterm outlook is favorable. And guess what the IMF says about the National Resource Fund? Directors welcome the authorities' Natural Resource Fund legislation for managing Guyana's oil wealth and emphasize the need to complement it with fiscal responsibility framework to avoid fiscal deficits. They commended the NFS framework and explained that it aims to save some of the resource income for future generations so that future generations can manage public spending. That's the legislation we brought. So, Mr. Speaker, let's come closer to home. Let's see what the Apnu+Afc actually did for public servants in Guyana when we continue to ponder what public servants got. In 2014, the minimum wage was $20,000. In 2015, it increased to $39,500. Later in 2015, from $39,500 to $50,000. a 26% increase one time. It was not the usual 5% that the members on the other side of this House have a tradition of using. No, Mr. Speaker, from 2016, 50,000 to 55,000, 2017, 55,000 to 60,000, a 20% increase. 2018
Honorable member, I'm just a little confused. There is the national minimum wage and the minimum wage in the public service. So I think there might be some synonymity.
I'm giving you the increases in minimum wage for the public service.
Thank you.
Which I mentioned before. In 2018, from 60,000 to 64,200, 2019, 64,200 to 70,000. We have a commitment, and every single year we made sure that the ordinary people of this country got an increase. So when the Honorable Minister of Health talks about unshackling the poor, we unshackle the poor. Mr. Speaker, this was no pre-election gimmick. Every year we ensured Guyanese had a little more. I think this is a good time to really look at some of the comments the previous speaker made. He talked about the sugar industry. The most disgraceful thing that he did this morning is to not mention the $300 million lost and squandered between 2008 and 2014. He refuses to accept that because of that, we had to start a process of diversification. When he talks about the hopelessness that pervades this land, let us say that is what's happening now. And then he talks about the reduction in VAT. I want to remind him that it was the PPP that first introduced VAT into the economy of Guyana, 16% VAT, and we started a process of slowly reducing it. And guess what? I asked him to show any items of food that have been reduced anytime VAT is reduced. So that is a fallacy. Now he talks about incomplete projects, and I really have too much to say to waste too much time on responding on that. But I do want to mention a few. The East Coast Road that we fixed, the East Bank Road, the Cato School that went over $1 billion thanks to the former and the current Minister of Education, the Chedi Jagan International Airport, which should have been done long ago. Let's talk about the building in High Street, a testimony to the reign of the PPP that stands there, unable to be used by any entity.
Honorable member, I'll give you back your time. Honorable member, Mr. McCoy, the list in front of you has guidance with respect to the kinds of words you can use in it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Skeldon, the specialty hospital, the road to nowhere that was supposed to go to a hydro project. Mr. Speaker, what is even sad is that when the PPP government talks about corruption, and the minister, we just got a rant of that, the minister again ceases to mention his daughter's scholarship, paid for by taxpayer people in Guyana, and the printing of our poetry book. Folks, do not throw stones if you live in a glass house. Mr. Speaker, having not been invited to consult on this prior budget, I do want to take this opportunity nonetheless to add my plea to an increase in the private sector minimum wage. This is long overdue. Mr. Speaker, under the Apnu+Afc administration, pensions were increased, public assistance, as you know, VAT reduced, schools, hospitals, first oil, improvements on the transparency index, all of that. Mr. Speaker, at this point, for what it's worth, I want to thank Minister Jordan for his stewardship of the economy. The success of his performance is in the testimony of the international organizations I quoted and are forever written in history and in the sands of times. Former Minister Jordan, their attempts to jail you and destroy your good reputation will fail. For what it's worth, I thank you on behalf of all Guyanese. I also apologize to the family, to his family, and many other families who have come to realize, as I was told recently, public service in Guyana is a burden and not the task that we all as Guyanese should be encouraged to bear. The constant assassination, verbal assassination of individuals and families and persons is totally unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, today governments all over the world are fighting to keep their economies intact and their citizens safe. It is unbelievable that the first 15 minutes, in fact, it was the last 5 minutes of his presentation, that the Minister of Finance mentions COVID and people's concerns. Maybe he has not seen the most recent post that is actually released today, which states that the Australian government has made a direct connection with HIV in some of the vaccines. They have now canceled from a particular company making the vaccine all over 50,000 orders. The minister would have been better placed to come and explain to the people of Guyana how we are going to ensure that the vaccines we take are safe, given information like that in the public domain. Mr. Speaker, the current Minister of Health went on a rampage about having to use the specialty hospital, whether we like it or not. That hospital, that facility was rebuilt in record short time in haste to provide a safe space for these highly contagious COVID patients to be isolated and treated away from other patients in other hospitals. This facility is still the only one of its kind. And instead of bad-mouthing it, which he did, and cussing it up, the Minister of Health had to put his behind and use the same location. Mr. Speaker, I want the nation to know that when we set up the COVID task force, we deliberately invited the PPP to be part of that task force. That was because we knew that in an area of health and a pandemic of this nature, all Guyanese had to be on board working together. They chose not to participate in this task force. Mr. Speaker, if we were big enough, if we could be better and bigger persons, the PPP would have sat on that task force. So the contributions of all sides could be received and decisions made in the interest of all Guyanese. Mr. Speaker, the first months after August 2020, the numbers show we had a massive increase in the numbers and deaths especially. And more this continues. And now we have many countries not wanting citizens of Guyana to travel to their countries. We're on another list. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to ICT development because I'm extremely proud of the success we had in those areas. We connected over 158 primary schools, 105 secondary schools, 30 technical and vocational institutes, opened 173 ICT community hubs in all regions, provided free internet to the regional democratic councils, the NDCs, internet to over 72 hinterland communities, smart classrooms, worked with agencies like PAHO with the smart hospitals. Yes, do a search of Google. Smart hospitals existed in Guyana prior to August 2020. Now, why am I saying all of this? I'm not tooting my own horn. But I am saying to the government, I am raising those facts because I'm showing you that we left an excellent infrastructure in place that gave us an edge in these COVID times. Instead, the current government was totally lax and did not utilize the foundation, the infrastructure that existed to be able to ensure that more of our children could learn online. Mr. Speaker, it is an undisputed fact that far more approved educational and learning opportunities are available on the web. We should all be ashamed, including me, when we realize that online learning in Guyana can only and is only the purview of the folks that have. Yes, Mr. Speaker, the parents and guardians that can give their child a device, a computer, a laptop, who can probably afford Blaze, an internet plan of some sort, a data plan maybe, food to nourish the brains of their children, and a quiet corner at home to learn. Mr. Speaker, the have-nots, still a large percentage of our population, have nothing to get, nothing to learn, have lost a year of formal education. You see, Mr. Speaker, these are the forgotten ones whose parents Guyana failed more than 2 decades ago between 1992 and 2015. Those were the children that went to schools that had a mere zinc sheet. And I traveled around enough in this country to be horrified at schools that have zinc sheets as the only roof, no insulation, and we expected them to learn in the midday sun. Many of those parents can't even help their children today. Mr. Speaker, in this budget, I am disappointed because there's no definitive statement or allocation for the have-nots of our society. How does a mother that can barely scrape together to purchase one device decide which of her 3 children she's going to give the gift of education to? A gift that is guaranteed in our Constitution. What is even more worrying, Mr. Speaker, is the current Minister of Education came to this House speaking about increases in spending on janitorial supplies, up 26%, cleaning and extermination up 41%. Cleaning the schools is what the Ministry of Education is supposed to do. Mr. Speaker, we would have been encouraged if she came and explained an exciting project like the ones we see in Trinidad and in Jamaica, where children are being given their own device. Mr. Speaker, we changed the 1 laptop per family program to 1 laptop per teacher program so that teachers could prepare better for our school children. And as I said, more than 2 years ago, our intention was to ensure that every child gets a device. In a COVID-ridden world, that is the minimum that we can do. The vision to provide this. And if it does exist in any part of the budget, we're hoping we will hear in the wrap-up. Mr. Speaker, the current program of asking mommy and daddy or a guardian to collect a workbook, carry it back to school after completion, go at their own expense to go and pick it up, especially if they had been fired or have no job or little money. All this means is that the workbooks don't work. Mr. Speaker, many of us received complaints about the errors in the workbooks. And as far as I know, spell check is still just a click away on a computer. On a specific comprehension assignment, the animal deer, D-E-E-R, was spelled as D-E-A-R consistently. So how dare an official come to this House and say it is acceptable to put those kind of errors in books that you want our children to work from? when your children, when your children have the luxury of private education. Mr. Speaker, I want you to know that the technology allows us to block any sites that persons might be worried about in terms of children accessing and using the facilities at the ICT hubs, at the schools, or whatever. What we had expected, what I expected, was a program that would have shown that between the Ministry of Education and also the citizens in a community, a program to ensure that that free internet would be available, safe distancing protocols in place for our children to continue to learn. Mr. Speaker, in many parts of rural USA, children are also being given a portable Wi-Fi device. They're available on Amazon.com. And funding to expand our e-government network, which was established in 2015, although the technology and the project to launch it was signed since 2012, we were the ones that put it into being. And the facility exists to expand that same e-government network and to ensure that children, especially in vulnerable groups, at specific times, can get free internet from that same network. Mr. Speaker, these are some of the things that we know could have been new projects in the same budget. Mr. Speaker, the National Data Management Authority, as you know, is the agency that runs and manages and maintains the e-government network. And guess what? We cannot comprehend how a few weeks ago, the government of Guyana, this current government, chose to close all the community development and social management divisions. So all the representatives from communities that we carefully chose to manage these locations, those 72 locations that are specifically in the hinterland area that Minister Sukai seems to have forgotten exist, those same locations where we found persons that had the skills to manage the technology, they were all sent home and the unit closed down. So when everybody else in the world is building their capacity, we are breaking it down, not using it, and closing it. Mr. Speaker, we had two major problems, two major projects. The Hinterland Poor and Remote Communities ICT Access Project, 17 million from the GRIF Fund, and also, as you know, the 37.5 million funds from the National Broadband Project. It is under these two projects that we were able to do and implement the massive expansion I mentioned earlier, never done before in the history of Guyana. What did we have before, Mr. Speaker? We had what we can define as the largest corruption scandal in the history of Guyana. A defunct fiber optic cable, monies used, no idea where the monies went, and not one service anywhere between Linden and Lethem that cable was supposed to provide. And here is the audit done by Raman McRae, who I know the current government have the utmost of confidence in them. The project was executed without appropriate project management documentation, including a project initiation document setting out a purpose, objective, scope, and deliverables. The total ICT project cost amounted to 13 billion not million folks, 13 billion in one side of the project, and then a further 2.9 billion. The budget was to be financed by central government, while 10 billion was budgeted to be financed from a loan. So you know, the ordinary people of Guyana are still paying for that. Yeah. And who was the project manager? Mr. Alexei Ramatar, project manager in the
Honorable
document.
member, remember I just cautioned the government side about naming people who can
I
defend.
withdraw that. The prominent son of a very prominent former president. And what did they say? No inventories. The listing provided by the project manager did not include costs. Most significant element, no inventory listing. And listen to the information on the banking. The honorable project manager, they put the name, so I got to take out the name. The project manager advised that he was never in possession of any bank statements and no bank reconciliations were ever performed, even though the bank account was used on a regular basis to pay contractors. This appears to indicate that the control of funds was not considered a priority. Once again, who is this PPP government to talk to us about corruption?
Honorable member, you have to withdraw that one too. Corruption.
Apologies, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw.
An honorable member,
Mr. Speaker.
in order to continue, we will need an extension.
Thank you. Comrade Speaker, I do move that the honourable member be given 5 minutes to conclude her presentation.
Thank you, Honorable Chief Whip. Honorable member, you may
Mr.
continue
Speaker,
to conclude.
I know you're a fair person. I'm hoping that you did include my extra time that I lost.
Yes, you got an extra minute because you were supposed to get that notice at 11:56. You got it at 11:57. You're starting now at 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and members of this honorable House and people of Guyana, I have spoken about the smart classrooms. What I will say is do a Google search. Do a Google search. And I want to remind the Honorable Minister of Education that all the equipment for the hubs, for the smart classrooms I listed, arrived in Guyana prior to August 2020. If the Minister of Education is telling me and this Honorable House that for the last 6 months they do not have the capacity to implement and to set up the equipment, I am guilty. Mr. Speaker, I want to go to telecommunications. I stand proud of the foundation that we laid in liberalization. I compliment the Honorable Prime Minister for completing the process for the benefit of all Guyanese. But, Mr. Speaker, there's some questions that I need some answers to. Honorable Prime Minister, liberalization could never be simply the signing and assenting to parts of legislation that we did not bring to the House. Mr. Speaker, the current government concluded, firstly, did the current government conclude a settlement agreement with GT&T and its parent company, AT&I? It was a well-known fact that there were pending taxes and GRA assessments which suggested the company owed in excess of $48 million in taxes. Transparency and accountability are important. The people of Guyana want to know if that money was recovered. It is not seen in any part of the budget. Mr. Speaker, if it was, we know that it should have been announced publicly as the law dictates. Then again, there were rights according to GT&T and AT&I. They assumed that the residual value was in excess of 100 million. And therefore, ending the monopoly, they assumed that there would be a payment for their loss of their time. Mr. Speaker, I will ask the Minister of Finance and the Honorable Prime Minister to explain whether an agreement was found on the value of that settlement. And of course, we want to know what were the agreements in terms of spectrum. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we want to know, we want to see the settlement agreement. Mr. Speaker, the people of Guyana will also remember that the Apnu+Afc government went to court to get the $5 million that was owed on the sale of shares to GT&T, which the previous government never collected. Again, we perused the estimates, and I don't see that in there. I'm happy, Mr. Speaker, that you are continuing with our two projects. Mr. Honorable Minister, Prime Minister, who Telecommunications now falls, and I'm happy to see that VAT was removed on data services. Mr. Speaker, I want to mention in closing that a lot of talk has been said about rigging in this House. We have a particular other member of the clock that has used the word riggers all the time. I want to remind the public and the people of this House, right, that we had an individual, a previous head of the Chief Elections Officer, a sheik of GCOM, who in 2011 manipulated the count. We seem to forget that. I sat at the Pegasus Hotel waiting for the results. And at the very last minute, we realized, thanks to the Honorable Mr. Vincent Alexander, that an extra seat was not to go to the PPP, but to the AFC. Since then, we know time is history. Mr. Speaker, it didn't stop there. In 2015, we had fake statement of polls. Is that possible? In the 2015 election? Yes, we remember that the security mark on those fake statement of polls finally came to the understanding of the people of Guyana. So, Mr. Speaker, again, don't talk to us about rigging.
Mr. Speaker, standing order 40. The matter that she refers to is sub judice. It was in the courts since 2015. And since 2015, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that was brought to the court in 2015. The election petition by the PPPC has not been heard up to now.
Honorable Minister, thank you very much. Honorable Member, please, that matter is still sub judice. You need to withdraw those, or we will strike them.
Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking on the fact that we have individuals in this room that use the word rig. And I have specifically, if the people of Guyana remember anything,
you
they
were
must
almost at the
remember
end of your presentation, so if you want to use
Speaker,
a few more seconds to do that.
Mr. Speaker, the constant severing of jobs by persons in this administration continue to create and support the perception that a particular race in this country is being targeted. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that like JFK said, both sides need to start exploring what problems unite us instead of belaboring the problems that divide us. Mr. Speaker, this country is my country too. My grandfather was part of the team that went to London to speak on our independence. My great aunt's music is in the tapestry of
Could
Guyana.
you cut the microphone, please?
Guyana.
Your time is up. Honorable members, I think this is a good time to take the suspension.